Okay, this is Ecosystem Approach to Fisheries Management 2, second video in the Ecosystem Approach videos of the lecture. And this is the question that we left you in Lecture 1. How would you solve the problem of bycatch and habitat destruction and integrate the protection of all species while still allowing for fishing to continue? Okay, so here's what I want you to consider. A terrestrial analogy. Okay, here's a picture of some farmland. A little bit of pasture here. Okay, there's a little bit of probably some scrubby territory where it's steeper. There'll be a river, a little stream through here, and probably too steep to farm. So it's still left in bush. Okay. Here's one type of agriculture, very intense, utilizing most all of the habitat that can be found. Okay, and you can see that there are little problems with erosion here, but very intense agriculture. Okay, and here we go. This is another bit of farmland with you can see that's been plowed here, and little corridors that have not been utilized. Okay. So what do you see in terms of, what do you see that's analogous, that's similar to fishing? You see lines along the ground that have been made by a tractor with a plow. Okay. Would you expect to have the same kind of lines from a trawler? Now, nobody on the planet, or not nobody, but because there are always lots of different types of opinions, and that's great, but most people on the planet would not say we should dispense with agriculture, that we should stop growing food in crops in this method, and that we should all go back to being hunter-gatherers. Okay, so it's true that we use some area of the ocean in this way, or of the land in this way. We have crops, we grow crops, but we don't use all of it, do we? See, these are areas with corridors that wildlife can move from one area of protection to another. You're going to have a high level of diversity in these areas compared to here. And you're going to have things like your large predators, so the deer or the large grazers, so deer, bobcats, or whatever might be in this area. If this is a North American habitat where I would tend to live, bears, or where I grew up, so this is familiar to me. So if I'm talking about the animals that were in my neck of the woods, we'd have things like squirrels, bears, deer, raccoons. All of that stuff would be able to live in this area and migrate from one part of it to the next. You don't see a lot of them living here, but the population is fairly well protected in this area. Okay, so let's think about that in terms of how we would manage the ocean. Okay, can we still do that? Can we possibly do this with our fishing rather than this with our fishing in the ocean? Okay, it's a very simple concept. You choose a certain percentage of all types of habitats and stop fishing. Okay, this is something that's been proposed for the area in southern Australia, around Tasmania. These would make up something like 10 to 20%, or probably about 20% of this area. It looks a little more than 10%, but this is if you look at all of the ocean, then you're talking about 20% of the representative habitat that is going to be found in this area. Although you can see that they don't go all the way up to shore, and that's probably the 3 nautical mile limit. So these are more open ocean reserves. Close to shore, you need to set up another network that would include a representative portion of all the habitats along these shorelines. But you could potentially eliminate fishing in all of these areas, which would be habitat reserves, fishing reserves, and refuges for those creatures that live in this open ocean, have no fishing, and possibly protect those species from ever being exploited, depending on their migratory habits, whether they leave or remain within those zones. So the ecosystem approach recognizes a few characteristics of essentially fish, but let's say aquatic organism. All right, fish. First off, don't live in isolation. Okay, so mostly we manage species as single species. We manage them as single stocks and independent of other stocks. But in fact, they don't live in isolation, and so our management probably shouldn't look at them in isolation. They live, breed, and exist in an ecosystem, and the health of that specific ecosystem is important if stocks are to be sustained and utilized. We know that human beings aren't as healthy if they live in cold, damp houses as compared to a dry, warm house through the winter. We get more respiratory problems and the like. If we compromise the health of a specific ecosystem that a stock lives in, then there's every reason to believe that the health of that stock is going to be compromised as well. Okay, ecological objectives are just as important as stocks to sustainability and social and economic factors. So we have to, if we're going to use the ecosystem approach, it requires a mindset shift that goes away from, well, the only thing that's important is jobs and the economy and how much money can we make. Can we make more money by trawling through all areas of deep water coral reefs? Nobody sees deep water coral reefs. Who cares if they're there? So, but if we do believe that there's some intrinsic value, that these things have merit and value on their own, then we have to take into account the ecological objectives, the objective of sustaining the ecology, and we have to enshrine that in fisheries managers and the politicians that make the edicts that the fisheries managers have to set the rules by, and these people have to have that in their mind, as well as the economic factor that sustainability of the ecology are as important as just the money side. Okay, so commonly cited marine reserve benefits. So these things can be considered an insurance policy against environmental variability and uncertainty. So if you've got an area where you have a wide range of sizes, ages, you have a full age structure and size structure right to a carrying capacity. You've got a population at that state, then they're going to have a lot more genetic variability than a population that is reduced. And so hopefully, if you have diseases or if you have some sort of environmental change, then the variability will allow those animals or plants to be able to adapt to those changing environments more readily than a compromised population. Okay, so nobody really knows about the fishery benefits might be for a marine reserve. Okay, the idea is that the populations that are in the marine reserve will have a very healthy breeding output, and since the the population within the reserve will be at carrying capacity. Then new individuals coming into the fishery or into that stock will probably either leave the reserve to find areas where they don't have to compete as much for resources, and also the larvae and offspring from the breeding stock will float out of the reserve as well. And so that by having a large breeding population, areas that are fished outside of the reserves could possibly increase their production. Ecosystem benefits, including habitat protection, opportunities to advance scientific knowledge. We know so little about the ocean. Doesn't it make sense to protect some areas, representative areas, so that if we do wind up damaging other areas through our activities, we can go back and say, well, this is what should be there, this is what was there. Now we at least know how we've impacted that environment. And opportunities to promote tourism. For example, Lee Marine Reserve, which had huge local opposition to becoming a marine reserve 35 years ago, now has a big tourist industry and has over 300,000 visitors a year coming to look at the marine creatures, the marine life in that reserve. So, where should we put them? Okay. Well, there's something called NIMBY, which is, you can have a look at these two YouTube videos, quite funny. George Carlin and another one, and they are comedians talking about not in my backyard, but something called NIMBY, not in my backyard. So, if you think of where you like to fish, would you say you live here in Tauranga, would you be happy if, and you're a fisher, would you be happy if all of the area from Matakana, from the Punny Punny Wharf down out to Karawa, across to Matakana, and down to Makatu was put into a marine reserve out to 5 miles out to sea? Well, I personally wouldn't be very happy with that at all, because that's where I catch a lot of fish. And so I wouldn't like to see that exactly put in, but it goes even shorter than that. It's even smaller areas. If people preserve, or people who are very commonly against or for marine reserves, you propose to put them in their area, and they suddenly become very opposed to it. Same thing happens with wind farms and hydroelectric schemes. All people who are in favor of renewable power schemes, they will fight to the tooth. They'll fight to the death about putting a wind farm in their backyard where they can see it in their view. So that's called NIMBY, not in my backyard. And check out these YouTube videos; they're quite funny. What about a Maori Mataitai versus a no-take reserve? Well, this could be something that can be a very important tool in fisheries management in New Zealand if we get behind it and support it. Okay, if the public at large gets behind it and supports it. So, if you think about the area around Motiti, and this is my own personal opinion now, but having dove Motiti and having continuously dove Motiti for about 8 or 10 years now, I've seen the crayfish population. It seems to me that the crayfishing is getting to be much more difficult, and that there are still lots of crayfish there, but they tend to be small, as in just over legal are the bigger ones. Okay. So what we're seeing, and this is unsubstantiated, but my sources are personal communication with local commercial fishers, is that a few years back that somebody purchased or leased quota that was available in Area 2, but used to be fished in up the East Cape, and now fishes that 5,000 kilos of crayfish in the Bay of Plenty close to the entrance here. A good portion of that effort being centered around Motiti and the Schooner Rocks and Tuckaroe Shoals and the like. So if I think of what 5 tons means in crayfish, it may not seem like a lot, but if they average a half a kilo per cray, that would be 10,000 crayfish more coming out of this area than there used to be. So that is a shift of effort from the East Cape to this area. And by all means, the crayfish diving may be fantastic up the East Cape because of that loss of pressure. But what we have is, because there's a boat here that would like to be close to Tauranga and would like to fish its quota in Tauranga, and maybe didn't have enough quota to be economic for using just that quota that it had in this area. It may have had to move to a different area to fish for part of the year previously. Now it can fish all of its quota, or enough quota to be economic out of one area. But that increases the fisheries effort in that one area, so we have localized depletion. So if we have a mataita, then what that can do is set up an area where local bylaws can be made, and you can have area-specific management, which can be done much more effectively at a much more local area, or a much more local level than across the whole of the quota management area. And so you could possibly put half of Motiti in a mataitai, still allow commercial fishing on the other half, but that would eliminate commercial fishing from that area. And I'm not proposing to eliminate commercial fishing, but just to use that mataitai as a way to limit the impact of that fishery on that area. But in terms of these marine reserves, you are limiting the rights of commercial fishers to access these areas. Okay, so they have that quota right, and they, by law at this point, have the right to access all areas. Okay, that we still have freedom of the seas unless those areas are marine reserves. And how big should they be to be an effective fisheries management tool? Is half of Motiti a big enough area? Should all of Motiti be a big enough area? Will that do anything for the local crayfish population, or do they migrate in and out? Well, the answer is going to depend on what you want to get out of that reserve. Is it going to be an area that people just come to snorkel and look at a few fish, or are you going to be using it as a fisheries management tool? And if so, for what species? The estimates that in literature that most people would agree with would be on the area of 25 to 30% of all types of habitats in order to have an effective fisheries management tool, in order to agree to, or in order to sustain a healthy breeding population, then 20 to 30% of all types of habitat, including open ocean, put into marine protected areas. Now, there's a lot of literature that says that, in fact, these fish would be too resident, they wouldn't be subject to exploitation, and all you'd have is a smaller population available in the areas outside the protected areas, and that the breeding effect wouldn't make up for that loss of area. But nobody really knows, because nobody's no place in the world has committed to this large an area. The last Labor government, now we're talking 9 years ago now, as I make this video in December 2012. So the last Labor government was committed to putting 10% of the exclusive economic zone in marine protected areas. Okay, the current national government has no stated policy on marine reserves. So about 30% or more. So how are we doing anyway? Well, currently in terms of no-take area, protected marine areas, they're 1/3 the size of the area of the smallest protected land area, Abel Tasman. So here's the Abel Tasman Park. Here is the area where the Abel Tasman Park is located, and here is the area of New Zealand. So we have nearly 1/3 of our terrestrial and land protected as a national park, and a good portion of that, of course, is an area that's unfarmable, and that's where a lot of the protected land tends to be, areas that were not utilizable as farms. But we've protected 1/3 of our land area in national park. Do you think anybody in New Zealand would be satisfied with 1/3 the size of Abel Tasman as a national park, across the whole of New Zealand? Nobody would be happy with that. But we seem to have accepted that quite happily in the ocean. Maybe it's time for a little mindset change. Okay, and how do they work? Let's see, I've alluded to this before, but the outflow or the spillover effect is the emigration of adults or juveniles out of the no-take area into adjacent areas where they can be exploited. These definitions, outflow or the spillover effect, are something that you will probably see again on your exam, so take note of those. So here's the reserve with larger breeding populations, and the larvae will go out into the non-fishery reserve where they're settled. So you got to think of this when you're putting marine reserves into place. So if you're going to put them into place to be effective, and we say Jamaica puts this area of its territory and open ocean into marine reserve. Okay. So you get a big snapper population here, and they breed lots of larvae, big currents that come this way. Okay. Well, Cuba, their snapper fishery is probably going to benefit greatly, but Jamaica, actually, who have gone to the trouble to put in that marine reserve and sacrifice that fishing area, it's not going to have a lot of the benefit from it. So really, what they need are they need reserves here in the Antilles, along this other area of Hispaniola. Okay. And these would need to be networked throughout the whole of the Mediterranean, the Caribbean. And here, you can see how these things are networked, hopefully, so that the organisms can go from one environment to the next, or at least the larva can. Because essentially what you want it to have is genetic flow through these, and have a large enough area protected so that you have adult populations protected. They should be able to move between these without being subject to inevitable exploitation, so that there can be enough genetic interbreeding. So how would you keep people from fishing in these areas? Another one that you can brainstorm. Okay. The answers are unknown, really, at this area, but they would take a lot of enforcement. Perhaps by reducing enforcement in other areas, you could put those resources into making sure that those marine reserves were protected. Okay, so this is also known as an holistic style of management, and this incorporates the species life cycle, migration, breeding grounds, food sources, and species interactions. It promotes biological diversity outside the traditional protected areas, may help counter the decline in plant and animal diversity. It's not a strategy to shut down fisheries, but modify the type of management and protect areas needed for spawning, feeding, and migration. International agreements to protect shared or common resources would need to be set into place, okay, especially for areas outside the exclusive economic zones, and they would have to be strictly enforced. And without public awareness and political will, none of this will happen. And even if it does happen, if the locals aren't in favor of it, they're not going to respect that reserve. So you do need public buy-in in order to have this perspective or this strategy to be successful. And as I say, at no place in the world has enough area been protected to know whether this system will work or not as a fisheries management tool. Okay. Management needs to include combined strategies of precautionary catch limits, bycatch controls, gear restrictions, distribution of fisheries, and marine protected areas. So nobody is really saying that that marine protected areas, no-take fishery reserves, are the only thing that you should do, but they could possibly be integrated as another management control. And of course, they don't work if the monitoring and enforcement is not in place. To a marine reserve took a long time to show any change to its stock or to its density of snapper and crayfish, but probably because it was still being fished quite hard. People were poaching in it a lot, and the big fish often are quite aggressive and can be taken out quite easily. If you think about Lee Marine Reserve, it'd take about 2 weeks if they opened it up before most all of the crayfish were gone and the big snapper had been caught. People would be in their hell for leather. Okay, a precautionary approach should be taken to avoid further stock collapses, and leaving fisheries management as it stands may cause ecosystem impacts that may be difficult or even possible to reverse. If we have some area that is not impacted, that acts as a reserve, as a reservoir, then those areas may be able to reseed the rest of the ocean if we screw it up too much. And that is the ecosystem approach to fisheries management.